Thank you for the invitation to be here today and to be part of this important conference. It's a first experience for me. It's a first experience in this wonderful city of Berlin, and it's also the first time I've ever spoken in a cinema. To come here to Berlin to talk about human rights in a place where you have already such important human rights social workers as Professor Prasad and the work of Professor Staub-Bernasconi is indeed a privilege for me. I'm not sure how much I can add to the work that they do, but I do want to share some ideas with you about human rights and social work. And I must apologise for not knowing German and for speaking in English. I'm very aware that English speakers like me are in the privileged position of not having really to know any other language, whereas everyone else in the world has to know at least one other language, and it's something that gives me cause for regret and that I feel somewhat apologetic about. Anyway. It's become a cliche to say that we live in turbulent times. Yet the last 12 months have massively increased the level of uncertainty, turbulence and shock. We've been caught by surprise. The neoliberal order is being eroded, which is what we may have been wishing for, but instead of a strong collectivist alternative, we're seeing the rise of forms of neo-fascism. Traditional social democracy, it appears, is too encumbered with neoliberal trappings to be a viable vision for an electorate calling for change, as a result of the compromises social democrats have made with the dictates of the market. The Trump election in particular has rendered much previous writing on politics, sociology, the environment and the future of democracy quite irrelevant. And it has done the same for social work. We are clearly at a pivotal point in human history with multiple threats to the world we have come to define as normal. The uncertainty of Trump, the shock of Brexit, economic instability and possibly serious economic collapse, the increase in racism and xenophobia, the threat of climate change, looming food crises caused by the overfishing of the oceans and the desertification of land, an increased likelihood of major global conflict, and the crisis in democracy and governance, as our political leaders are clearly unable to deal effectively with the multiple threats and crises that face us all. And this, of course, does not apply just in any one country in Germany or in Australia. It is applying in many countries around the world. In such a world, how can we talk about social work and human rights? And I want to suggest that this makes it both harder but more important to think about human rights and what they might mean. Ideas of human rights that in the West were until recently seen as widely accepted are now called into question, and the comfortable consensus that we used to assume no longer applies. Social workers used to be able to say that they believed and worked for human rights, and this was not regarded as problematic, but was accepted as a given that would receive more or less universal endorsement. That's no longer the case. Governments that once supposedly supported human rights are showing increasing signs of standing against human rights, particularly in the case of immigration, refugees and asylum seekers, but also in regard to the erosion of welfare state provisions which we had taken for granted, eroding rights to healthcare, to education, to housing and to income security. The increasingly precarious nature of work, with casualisation of the labour force and contract employment, is undermining the right to work for which trade unions fought so hard. rights to privacy, to freedom of expression, to freedom from intimidation, are in many places under attack, often through new forms of rights violation online, which were undreamt of when the UN human rights regime was established. It has become increasingly clear that the apparently consensual commitment to universal human rights was weak and was readily undermined by some very powerful interests. Voices that argue against human rights are now becoming stronger and are given a legitimacy that, at least in the West, would have been unthinkable only 10 years ago. We're therefore forced into a position where we feel we need to defend the very idea of human rights. It used to be that we could indulge in critiques of conventional human rights that could loosely be categorised as from the left. Feminist critiques have highlighted the patriarchal nature of traditional human rights, privileging the rights of men in the public domain rather than the rights of women and children in the domestic sphere. Post-colonial critiques have shown how the idea of universal human rights has been laden with Western Enlightenment assumptions and have become part of the colonialist domination of people from the global south in the name of development. And postmodernist critiques have identified human rights as part of heroic modernism, seeking to impose a single, unified and rational order through the characteristically modernist mechanisms of the law, thereby devaluing cultural context, cultural difference, and the importance of diversity. Now, these critiques are important and have led us to a more nuanced view of human rights and of universalism, rather than uncritically accepting human rights as a form of totalising dogma not to be questioned. They do not necessarily question the idea and importance of human rights. Instead, they encourage a more reflexive stance. But we must now be particularly careful in how those critiques are articulated, as these critiques can easily be seen to reinforce the assault on ideas of human rights that is coming from the resurgent political right. This neoliberal view mistrusts the very idea of human rights, and where it does acknowledge them, seeks to limit human rights to the right of freedom of expression, including the right to make offensive and degrading comments with impunity. And according to the Australian Attorney General, there is even a right to be a bigot. That's the sort of world we live in. And the right to own property, even to the level where that right is denied to others, and creates housing crises and so on. Beyond that, the political right will not go, and other human rights are denounced as political correctness, limitations on freedom, and as dangerously socialist. The political right seeks, where possible, to abolish or at least weaken human rights legislation, convention and commissions. In my own country, the Conservative government is continuously criticising and assaulting the Human Rights Commission and the work that it does. It's a very limited understanding of what human rights are about. Human rights represent the value of humanity, however that might be defined, and the dominant neoliberalism defines humanity purely in terms of free speech and the ownership of property and wealth. There is no acknowledgement of the rights to become culturally active, educated, secure, healthy and articulate citizens, with guaranteed basic levels of personal security, economic security and conviviality. Indeed, the neoliberal right is far more concerned that the rights of corporations, rather than the rights of human beings, be guaranteed in treaties, laws and regulations. They are concerned with the globalisation of free trade, whereas human rights are concerned with the globalisation of free humanity. Beyond that very limited view, traditional ideas of human rights are under attack. And it's important that the value of human rights and the value of humanity be strongly asserted, more than we are accustomed to doing. In doing so, it is important to recognise that human rights do not necessarily equate to social justice, at least in the neoliberal world. Rights of freedom of expression, regardless of whom we may offend, rights to own property, even to the level of extreme excess, have little, if anything, to do with social justice, and indeed can work against social justice. And human rights can be, and has been, used in ways that reinforce patriarchy, colonialism, and Western individualism. If human rights are to be useful for social workers, we must articulate them in a much more nuanced and sophisticated way, emphasising economic, social and cultural rights, collective rights, and the importance of the context within which human rights are defined, claimed and achieved. One way in which social work has become enmeshed in the neo-liberal discourse is that we have concentrated on the ideas of rights and less on the ideas of the duties and responsibilities that go with those rights. This is the problem with equating human rights with freedoms. I think we've made a mistake by equating human rights and freedoms. They are not the same. Seeing rights as freedoms readily leads to human rights as a set of largely selfish claims with little consideration of the way the exercise of those rights needs to be constrained by moral and ethical considerations. We are thus free to exercise our rights whenever we want, however we want, as much as we want, without regard for others. Social workers have perhaps been reluctant to talk about duties and responsibilities because this sounds too much like the control and coercion used by conservative governments, emphasising the duty of citizens to conform. But ideas of duties, obligations or responsibilities are necessary to any rights regime. Without them, rights lose their context and their embeddedness within the social. With the right of freedom of expression goes the responsibility to exercise that right in such a way that it does not offend or demean others. With the right to vote goes the responsibility to inform oneself about the issues and to vote responsibly. And I would suggest that there are so many people who do not take that responsibility seriously that we get the tragic governments that we deserve. The right to education, with that right goes the responsibility to take advantage of that right to become an educated, contributing citizen. With the right to own property goes the responsibility to limit the extent of that ownership so there's enough for others. And that what is missing in neoliberal narratives, where humanity is defined in terms of individual passive consumption rather than active collective citizenship. Social work that only recognises rights without also promoting citizenship responsibility can readily reinforce dominant neoliberal ideology. We have, I would suggest, been too ready to accept uncritically the Western Enlightenment modernity construction, not just of human rights, but of the human who has the rights. Conventional human rights have been defined in such a way that they are the rights of a particular sort of human and imply a particular vision of humanity and its ideals. It is a view of humanity defined as individual, male, secular, youthful, able-bodied, and white. Anyone else is seen as not fully reaching the human ideal, and so we need to define human rights for them. Anyone other than this ideal is ascribed human rights, the rights of women, of children, of people with disabilities, of religious minorities, of the aged, of Indigenous people, of refugees, and so on, because of a perceived deficit. All of these categories somehow fall short of modernity's human ideal, so we give them human rights as some sort of compensation. This is a deficit view of rights, readily leads to a colonialist and condescending form of practice of social inclusion, which subtly disempowers and devalues those who need to be given rights. We include them in our society. And it leaves unchallenged the neo-liberalism which has led to the exclusion. We need to recognise that the world is changing and that there is no longer a consensus about the desirability of Western modernity. The project of neoliberal globalisation is showing signs of coming to an end. This poses challenges for social work, which is largely a child of Western modernity, and also for human rights, as the contemporary narrative of human rights grew out of the Enlightenment project. So when we think about social work and human rights, we need to think about how these ideals might be reformulated for a very different future and a chaotic and unpredictable world. I believe that in this newly emerging world order, ideas of social work and human rights will remain vitally important, and in fact more important than ever. Social work will be important because it is social work. It is about relationships with the importance of the social, of the collective, at a time when individualism has reigned supreme and has been shown to ignore important aspects of the human condition. Human rights will all be important because they are human rights and are about affirming the primary value of humanity at a time when the idea of the human is under attack from three directions. From the economic rationalists, who've sought to devalue humanity in the interests of the economy. From technology, which is beginning to replace human activity with robots, online resources and artificial intelligence. And from the need to adopt a less anthropocentric worldview in the era of the Anthropocene, in the interests of future generations and in the interests of other species of life with whom we share the planet. There's therefore a need for us to evaluate what we mean by humanity and human values, and those are at the core of social work. So how can we develop a social work perspective on human rights? Here it's necessary to address the way in which lawyers have dominated the human rights field, and to recognise that social workers have a very different orientation in doing human rights work. When we think of human rights as being defined and protected through the law, we limit our understanding of what human rights are about. I need to make it clear that I'm not against human rights law and human rights lawyers. They've played a really important role in the definition and protection of human rights. But rather, I'm arguing that we can take a broader view of human rights, seeing human rights as essentially social, the domain of social workers. There are three problematic aspects of the legal approach to human rights that we need to consider. The first is the individual basis of the legal perspective. Most laws are concerned with individuals and with regulating individual behaviour. Even when they apply to collectives, such as the actions of corporations, there is a strong tendency to identify and punish the individuals responsible for any misdemeanour. This is reinforced by the popular media seeking individual scapegoats where possible, rather than focusing on systemic issues. Somebody must take the blame is a common cry in the popular press, and indeed it is reinforced by ideas that a CEO must take ultimate responsibility. The buck stops here, President Truman said. The idea that there must be an individual or several individuals who are at fault effectively draws attention away from collective experience and systemic causes of human rights violations. The International Criminal Court, the ultimate legal human rights court, only deals with individual violators, not systems or states. This individualism, reinforced by a dominant neoliberal discourse, leads to a particular framing of human rights, one that is peculiarly suited to the law and the characteristic way we seek to regulate the behaviour of individuals. The second characteristic of a legal human rights regime is that the law in a Western liberal society is overwhelmingly negative. The basis of a free society is that we're free to do whatever we want to, as long as we don't break the law. The law, therefore, tells us what we are not allowed to do, but does not tell us what we should do. It is therefore about negative sanctions rather than positive actions. It's not concerned with how we ought to live. This is left to other disciplines such as ethics, morality, religion, voluntary association, outside the scope of the law. Taking a legal view of human rights, therefore, concentrates on the negative, on the prevention of human rights abuse, rather than the realisation of people's rights and the affirmation of their humanity. It thus privileges civil and political rights, which require protection, which can be achieved through the law, rather than economic, social and cultural rights, which require positive provision of health and education and welfare, rather than protection. This negative view is very limiting. Human rights can only be fully realised if people and institutions are motivated by values, ethics and morality, rather than simply a fear of breaking the law. After all, nearly all of our day-to-day human actions, through which we either affirm or deny the rights of others, are not undertaken because of the law, but for other, more human motivations. The third characteristic of the legal approach to human rights is its essentially top-down nature. Laws are enacted by parliaments, regulations drawn up by governments, and the UN instruments are determined at the level of international diplomacy. Hence, under the legal human rights regime, human rights are defined and imposed by elites, and ordinary people have little or no say in what those rights are or how they are to be realised. That, we might argue, is itself a human rights violation, a violation of our right to define our rights. It encourages people to accept human rights as given and denies people agency in human rights determination. Yet surely this top-down approach to rights deserves a critique. The critique has been that those who define human rights have been mostly privileged white men, and hence it is the rights of privileged white men that have been dominant. There have certainly been significant attempts to have the voices of women and people of other cultures heard in human rights debates, but they have still largely been the voices of privileged women and privileged people of diverse and racial and cultural identities. And this is inevitable in a human rights discourse that is dominated by lawyers and a legal worldview. In considering those three characteristics of legal human rights, individualism, negativism, top-down elitism, it becomes possible to articulate a social work approach to human rights, as social workers can work with the opposites of those three. Social work, after all, is social work, as I said before. It works with the social, with relationships, with collectives, and refuses to define humanity, or the humans that have rights, as atomised individuals. A social work approach to human rights will surely emphasise both the collective approach to rights, where relationships are central, but also a systemic approach where we can see the importance of systems, of organisations, of discourses of power, of structural disadvantage, and so on. These go well beyond the individualism of the law. Social work can also counter the negative approach of human rights that is implied by the legal perspective. Social work practice is about promoting more fulfilling lives for people. And social workers, perhaps other than those in authoritarian settings, do not tell people what they can't do. Rather, social workers encourage them to think about what they might do and help to open up possibilities for people, provide them with resources to do so. A perspective on human rights as about what we should do rather than what we mustn't do, requires discourses other than the legal, especially a discourse of the ethical. And social workers are particularly good at ethics. We can analyse, conceptualise and enact ethical practice in a deeper and more thoughtful way than most other professions. And we tend to see ethics as more than simply avoiding unethical behaviour, but rather as what it means to practice ethically. Social workers are concerned with values and morality, and we understand that there is a limit to the extent to which morality and values can be legislated. Thirdly, social work, especially in its community development mode, is able to work effectively in a bottom-up way, so that the dominance of the top-down perspective can be challenged and people and communities can have a real sense of ownership of human rights. Human rights are about relationships. An individual in total isolation, the individual on the desert island, has no rights, as there is nobody to meet the responsibilities that go with those rights. If you're alone on a desert island, your right of freedom of speech is irrelevant. Your right to health care is irrelevant, and so on. Most people experience relationships in families and communities rather than in their interaction with the state and the legal system. And so it is at that level of lived human experience that we need to understand and work for human rights from below. And social workers are ideally placed for this sort of human rights practice. So human rights-based social work should not simply follow the lead of the lawyers and find ways to put human rights law into practice. This is, of course, important work. I don't want to devalue the work that social workers do with that. It's been the focus of some of the literature about human rights-based social work. It's helped to move social work away from the simply therapeutic, with its essentially conservative practice of helping people to fit in and adjust, with the temptation of judgments of who is deserving without questioning the fairness of the system they have to adjust to. So human rights-based social work in that more limited way has been useful, I think, for social work. But I believe social work can achieve so much more by concentrating on the things we can do well and that lawyers don't do so well. Thinking and working in terms of relationships, the social, community, and so on. Framing our work around ethics, morality, and values, what is right, rather than around what should be prohibited, what is wrong. And tapping into social work's community development origins and traditions, practicing human rights from a bottom-up perspective. I want now to turn to a point I alluded to earlier. In thinking about human rights, we have tended to think about the problematic nature of rights, but to ignore the equally problematic nature of human. By focusing on the human, we can elaborate human rights in a way that facilitates good social work practice. The definition of what counts as human is contested. There have been many instances in history where some people have been defined as subhuman and treated with contempt. After all, if someone is less than fully human, they cannot be said to have human rights. However, the contested definition of human also causes problems in less dramatic ways. For example, we regularly deny to children many of the rights we define as human rights, such as the right to vote, the right to work, the right to freedom of movement, and so on. If those are human rights, does this imply that somehow children are not fully human? If the rights of children are different from what we call human rights, and some of those human rights do not apply to children, our understanding of the human can be seen to be problematic. And the same argument can be made for other groups to whom we deny some accepted human rights. Prisoners, people with severe dementia, people with severe intellectual disability, and so on. This means that such groups are in particular danger of suffering human rights abuse, and social workers will often collude with this by acting what are seen as in their best interests. We only need to remember the awful things that have been done by social workers acting in the best interests of children, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, and so on, to see the dangers of this ready denial of humanity. And certainly in my own country, the history of social workers in taking Indigenous children away from their families is something we now realise was a major human rights abuse. The Australian Association of Social Workers has delivered a formal apology for the former actions of social workers in that sort of practice. But it's so easy to fall into that I'm acting in their best interests mode. But we can interrogate the idea of the human who has the rights at another level. Human rights, it's commonly asserted, are about enabling people to achieve their full or true humanity. But this implies a construction of an ideal humanity, and this is of course highly contextual. As I suggested earlier, the conventional narrative of human rights assume a human ideal derived from the European Enlightenment. This is the ideal human who has the rights, and people who do not live up to this ideal are seen as not having achieved full humanity. They are deficient in some way, and we need to impose a rights regime on them to bring them up to standard. Human rights thus becomes a mechanism to ensure conformity to the Western ideal. This view, of course, has been strongly critiqued. As noted earlier, the feminist critique, the post-colonial critique, the postmodernist critique in particular have been strong. But despite these critiques, it's not hard to see the influence of Enlightenment modernity on human rights. And this is why many groups, especially from non-Western or Indigenous cultural traditions, find it hard to relate to traditional human rights at the present time. Note that this is a departure from the more conventional ways of dealing with issues of cultural difference and human rights. Traditionally, attention has focused on the ideal of rights and how they can be defined in a non-colonial way. I'm suggesting that rather than the idea of rights, it's the idea of human that needs to be interrogated. Human rights-based social work, therefore, requires an exploration of humanity, of what it means to be human in different contexts, and to help people articulate their ideas of an ideal humanity. And this may well be very different from the conventional Enlightenment view. This in turn suggests that a focus on humanity and the idea of humanity needs to be central to social work. And in doing so, we need to acknowledge that to see humanity in terms of isolated individuals is a very limited view indeed. Most of us realise our humanity not in splendid isolation, but in relationship with friends, family members, community, and so on. Our humanity, and hence our human rights, are at heart social, and thus social workers are ideally placed to be human rights workers, in a very different way from the lawyers. This emphasis on humanity implies that the study of humanity, that is, the humanities, needs to be a central focus for social work education. Social workers can and should be as informed by the humanities as they are by the social sciences. And yet the humanities do not appear to be central to most curricula in social work schools. And tragically, the humanities are being devalued by many universities and students in this neoliberal age. I would suggest that social work cannot be creative, imaginative, or relevant for the human condition unless it has a solid grounding in the humanities. History, literature, art, philosophy, theatre, poetry, cultural studies, and so on. And this must not be confined only to Western European cultural traditions of the humanities. Voices of other traditions in the global south are critical to our understanding of the human. This is important because the values of humanity, however that is constructed, are central to social work. In these difficult times when the values of humanity are under threat, it is more important than ever that social workers articulate and defend these values and take public stands in support of those values that are at the heart of our profession. This is the time for social workers to stand up and make their presence felt and their voice heard, in opposition to social and political forces that are contrary to social work values. For this reason, we need to have a strong yet nuanced vision of a diverse humanity, which can be forcefully argued and forcefully defended, both in the public sphere and also in the academic community. As I indicated before, we are now historically at a point of major crisis, and the future is far from certain. Social workers will need to operate in a context of crisis and change. Social workers are actually good at doing that. We work with people whose lives are characterised by crisis and change. But in doing so, the values of humanity need to be strongly asserted. I think social workers actually have the skills and understanding to be a really important profession in the years to come. But here we come to a paradox. Many of the problems facing the contemporary world have arisen as a result of our anthropocentrism. As many people now acknowledged, we are living in the Anthropocene, an era where human activity has made a permanent change to the very physical state of the earth. Our continuing assumption that the human is separated from something called nature has resulted in us treating the world as if it is there exclusively for human benefit and as a limitless source of energy and resources and a limitless garbage dump for our waste. The impact we've had on the rest of the natural world can no longer be ignored. And we have already impacted the natural world to such an extent that the future will be more dangerous, chaotic and unstable than we have been used to. A sad legacy for future generations. Climate change, it's here. Because of this, there is now a strongly recognised need to adopt a more ecocentric, less anthropocentric worldview, recognising that humans are interdependent with the rest of the natural world and do not stand apart from or above nature. This requires a radically different ontology, especially for those of us in the so-called developed West, and the people with the best understanding of such a worldview and what it implies are the indigenous peoples of the world and others from the global south. It's become necessary and urgent for the developed world to stop and listen to the voices of indigenous people, not as problems, clients, or people needing to be helped, but as people with the ideas needed to change the world. Such social workers are working extensively with indigenous communities and communities from the global south, and are in a position to validate and promote their voices. And of course, there are now many indigenous social workers whose perspectives on the social, community, family and sustainability can inform a social work practice that is more in tune with an ecocentric worldview. Social workers work with the divisions caused by privilege in its various forms, and those disadvantaged by the structures and discourses of privilege. White privilege, male privilege, class privilege, age privilege, ability privilege, sexuality privilege, and so on. We are good at that form of analysis and at developing practice that emerges from it. It has now become important to extend that perspective of privilege to include human privilege, recognising that it is the arrogance of human privilege that has led to the ecological crisis that has already fouled much of the earth, depleted and poisoned the oceans, rendered species extinct, and now threatens our own future. This suggests that it is no longer enough to talk about human rights alone. While, as I suggested earlier, we need to affirm the values of humanity, at the same time we need to decenter humanity from our moral reasoning and recognise that our humanity is bound up with the health and well-being of other species, and indeed of the earth itself. It is important to note the initiatives taken in Bolivia and Ecuador to define the rights of Mother Earth in law and constitutional guarantees, and the recent decision in New Zealand to grant legal rights to a river. These are exciting developments, but they run into the danger of romanticising nature, seeing it simply as benign and bountiful. All we have to do, we are told, is return to nature and all will be well. But nature is not just benign and benevolent, it is also threatening and dangerous. After all, nature is not only beautiful trees and rivers and flowers, it also includes earthquakes, tsunamis, poisonous snakes, mosquitoes, viruses, and so on. We need to connect to nature and to realise that humans are part of nature and interconnected and interdependent with other species, but do so recognising that nature can be hostile as well as nurturing. And this is to be respected. Modernity's heroic attempts to master nature for human ends were partly also an attempt to protect ourselves from nature's multiple threats and dangers. If we're to extend our understanding of the social and of community to include the non-human world, and I believe we need to do this, we need to do it with our eyes open, recognising that it is not an easy path, not replacing our contempt for nature with a romantic embrace of nature, but rather learning from Indigenous people that both these stances, exploiting nature and romanticising nature, are flawed, and that what we need to learn is to recognise that we are part of nature and treat nature with deep respect. This is a major challenge for anyone concerned with human rights and indeed for social work. As soon as we use the term human rights, we run the danger of anthropocentrism, thinking only about humans. Extending the social and community and rights to include the non-human world represents a challenge of major proportions, and we need to reformulate our ideas of both rights and justice. Yet it is necessary if our profession is to remain relevant in future decades. At the same time, we must remember that the most disadvantaged of the human population are the least responsible for ecological disaster. There's a real danger that the disadvantaged, who've been social workers' primary concern, will be discarded in our pursuit of a more sustainable and ecologically sensible way of living. We just have to look at the way nations of the developed nations don't even want to talk about environmental refugees, climate refugees. Hence, as I indicated earlier, the need for social workers to be both asserting the values of humanity and decentering the human at the same time, however contradictory that might sound. And I want to conclude with just a few suggestions for social work in relation to this rapidly shifting context of human rights. First, social work, as I've said, must publicly affirm the values of humanity, standing against the frightening directions that neoliberalism has taken us, and in the face of the unthinkable horrors promised by the potential ascendancy of the far right. This will require strong collective social work advocacy. Social work, of course, has always been political, but at these times we must be overtly and strongly political, taking a stance on issues where the values of humanity are compromised. We cannot sit idly by and watch the increasing racism, the xenophobia, the mistreatment of refugees and asylum seekers, the obscene levels of inequality. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that yet. The obscene levels of inequality, the assault on democracy, and the increased levels of surveillance by both state and private agencies. These are utterly opposed to the values of social work, and it is imperative that social workers collectively take a strong stand. Whatever critiques we may have of the nuances of human rights, it remains true that the language of human rights is powerful and resonates across society. It's an important way that those values of humanity can be articulated. Second, social work needs to stand with and be part of the various social movements working for change. This is hardly a new role for social workers. They've been part of the peace movement, the labour movement, the feminist movement, the human rights movement, and so on. Contemporary social movements are often more temporary and fragmented. For example, the Occupy movement. and they are often located in whole or in part in the virtual world. But these social movements, for the most part, are articulating values that are similar to those of social work, and they represent important voices calling for change. Third, it is important for social work to have a strong community development focus to our practice. In the future, it is unlikely that there will be resources for individualised, professionalised services for the people social workers serve. More collective, community-based solutions to social problems will need to be found. We must abandon ideas of independence. Dependence is not in itself, dependence on others is not a bad thing. And we need to assert an ideology of interdependence, where dependency on each other is actually promoted and celebrated. This fits with a human rights perspective. We cannot achieve our rights in isolation. Rather, we require some kind of community of rights and responsibilities in order to realise our full humanity. So human rights work also becomes community development work. Social work has a long tradition of community work, though it's often been devalued because of the dominance of individualist, neoliberal and medicalised narratives. It's become important to reaffirm that community focus. It's also through community work that social workers can play important roles in the transition to a new society, and ensuring that such a new society incorporates important social work values. This is because change will emerge from the margins rather than from the centre. It is in the marginalised communities, bypassed by the global economy, that we find creative alternatives, where people are experimenting with new economic forms of economy and community. This is happening already in many marginalised communities around the world, often unheralded. And when modern globalised neoliberal society starts to erode, if not collapse, it is those marginalised communities that we're likely to find progressive alternatives that can help to forge a different world. And marginalised communities is where we find social workers. As a consequence, social workers who work with marginal communities are most likely to find themselves in central positions to institute progressive social change. The fourth potential direction for social work is to seek to develop a more ecocentric practice, defining social and community in ways that extend beyond the human will be an important challenge for social workers this century. This does not mean that we deny humanity, or even that there are significant differences between humans and the rest of nature. After all, we can expect humans to be reflective, capable of moral reasoning and of dialogical action in ways that we cannot apply to horses, spiders, fish, trees or rivers. But we can think about how those living beings share ecosystems with us and how we have moral responsibilities to them because of our interdependence. This can then flow into social work practice. As well as thinking about the social environment of an individual or a family, we can also consider their relationship with the natural world, with land, animals, plants, and so on. As well as drawing genograms and sociograms, where we draw diagrams of people's relationships, we could also draw something called ecograms, where we draw people's connection to the natural world, to the land, to the physical environment. In doing so, the worldviews of Indigenous people have much to teach us, because Indigenous social workers will be leaders in these developments. After all, they will, as a matter of course, understand a human being as intimately connected to the natural world, which leads to asking different questions, exploring different alternatives, and implementing different practices. These ideas are very new for mainstream social workers, and we're still grappling with what they might mean in practice. Please don't ask me for the answers to these, because I don't think any of us know them. But to me they're very exciting and challenging, as they represent an important way towards a more just, sustainable and enjoyable world. The road ahead will not be an easy one for social workers. indeed for anyone who cares about the future of humanity. A future of turbulence, crisis and uncertainty seems inevitable, with the crisis of neo-liberalism and of modernity. But social workers are used to working with crisis, change and uncertainty, the characteristic experience of those who use our services. We know from our practice experience that crises are also opportunities, if viewed creatively and imaginatively. Human rights will be under attack, but will also, if understood in a more nuanced way, be a really important way of framing the essential values in social work and of social workers, in alliance with others, helping to bring about a world where future generations can thrive in both interdependence and diversity. Thank you.